Space, the cosmos, the universe is an idea, a place, a concept that has been haunting the human mind for literally thousands and thousands of years. From time immemorial, our species has been strongly interested in and influenced by the stars. Just think about it for one moment. Would the history of maritime trade have been possible without the astrolabe? Would the development of agriculture in medieval Europe have been possible if attention had not been paid to the cosmos? Something that helped our ancestors know when the time was right for each stage of cultivation. And, of course, beyond studying the universe for such practical means, we cannot forget or even deny that the stars have also had a strong influence, an enormous attraction, an amazing power to give flight to our fantasy and imagination. All the way back in the 2nd century, in his work A True Story, writer Luciano de Samosata fantasized about the idea of reaching the stars, of seeing extraterrestrial worlds, and even imagined wars between the monarchs of other planets. And he was not the only one. Since then, many others like Cyrano de Bergerac, Daniel Defoe, and of course Jules Verne, they continued to fantasize about flying to distant alien worlds. But don't worry, don't panic, this video is not about the history of astronomy or science fiction. On the 20th of December 2019, President Donald J. Trump signed, as is customary, the defense budget for the following year. However, in that act, S-1790, there was something that was far from normal. You see, on that day at Andrews Air Force Base, President Donald Trump created the USSF, the United States Space Force. And the question is, was this more than just a headline? Has there ever been anything like this before in the United States? Are there plans to militarize space with weapons orbiting the Earth? Are we about to have all of our sci-fi fantasies come true? Well, today we will answer all of those questions. But first, we need to look at some history.
The race for space domination.
The 1950s, the Cold War, two titans at odds, a struggle between communism and capitalism, the Soviet Union versus the United States. You could say that the starting gun that marked the beginning of the space race was fired by the Soviet Union on the 4th of October 1957. On that day, the Sputnik 1 satellite was put into orbit. And, as you can imagine, over in the land of rock and roll, apple pie and hamburgers, the launch of Sputnik left a pretty bad taste in the mouth. It was totally unexpected. And, to top it all off, it wasn't the only one. Less than a month later, the USSR was launching its Sputnik 2, sadly famous for launching the poor little dog Laika as a crew member. Let's all take a moment. It's just so sad. The fact is though, it wasn't until the following year, 1958, that the Americans were finally able to move their playing piece from the starting box in this particular race. They did so with the launch of their first satellite, the Explorer 1. But, although the Americans got their act together with their first satellite and the creation of NASA in 1959, in 1961 the Soviets once again left the world speechless. On April 12th of that year, a young Yuri Gagarin became the first person to navigate in space. Upon his return, he was received as a true international superhero. Just a few weeks later, the American Alan Shepard followed him, but of course, they had already won that match in Moscow. And, the fact is, during the first part of the space race, the Soviet Union was clearly ahead. The USSR managed to successfully conclude mission after mission, abandoning the Earth's orbit, landing on the moon, yes, landing on the moon, and even undertaking the first mission to Venus. They seemed unstoppable. Listen up.
Luna 9 was the first soft landing mission on the moon. The Soviet spacecraft arrived 3 years before the first humans stepped out on the surface. It was part of a long-range Soviet Union program to photograph and learn more about the moon. Space.com.
However, hold on just one moment, because on the 25th of May 1961, something happened that would forever change the position of these counters on the particular game board we're talking about. That day, John F. Kennedy gave a speech to the US Congress in which he set a new national priority: to make a man, clearly an American man, walk on the moon and return home safely. They had to achieve this before the end of the 1960s. And, as we often say, no sooner said than done. On the 20th of July 1969, the United States made a somewhat unique entry into history. On that day, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon, marking a giant leap for mankind.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But I know what you're probably thinking at this point. You're thinking, all right, Grant, but these are all things that we know. But this is VisualPolitik. Our role is to try and look beyond and figure out what weight, what role, and what political influence this kind of space race had. And that is exactly what we're going to do. And the first key to understanding this whole story is to take a look at the main differences that existed between the Soviet and the American space programs for decades. You see, although the Soviet Union militarized its space race from very early on, let's say that this was something that the Americans did not consider at first, at least not in the same terms. Let me explain. President Eisenhower himself, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike to his friends, wrote to Bulganin, the president of the USSR Council of Ministers, and to Khrushchev, his Soviet counterpart, a series of letters in 1957 and 1958 to convince them to make the space mission a project of scientific cooperation between the two countries rather than a race. Of course, he failed. Still, the Americans did not throw in the towel. Soon after, they created NASA in the same spirit, as a completely civilian and independent agency. And not only that, thanks to the Space Act of 1958, American scientists had a lot of freedom to carry out their research on space. This was very different from the USSR, whose space mission was tightly controlled by the Ministry of General Machine Building of the USSR, the ministry answering to the USSR Military Industrial Commission of the USSR Council of Ministers. Whew! We got through all those acronyms. However, JFK, there's another acronym, he tried again. In the wake of Eisenhower, JFK also tried to turn the space race into a space of detente and cooperation with his then arch-enemy of the hammer and sickle. In fact, in his first speech as president, he uttered these words.
Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars.
But, my friends, Khrushchev once again turned a deaf ear. That selective hearing continued up until 1962 when the United States managed to put John Glenn into orbit. At that point, the Soviets finally began to test the ground for possible space cooperation with the Americans. And, of course, NASA took up the gauntlet instantly. The two great arch enemies of the time reached an unprecedented agreement, an agreement by which they undertook to share, among other things, weather forecasts. And yes, I know, it might seem insignificant, but think about what that meant symbolically. Not to mention, it was against the backdrop of the almost paranoid atmosphere of secrecy in the USSR. So don't go thinking that this was a piece of cake, because it was far from it. The chief scientists of the Soviet Union themselves, for example, Mstislav Kleldish, president of the Academy of Sciences, did not see why on earth they had to share their findings with the enemy, even though it was only about meteorological data. But, of course, the context was terrible. Look at the case of Keldysh himself, the president of the Academy of Sciences. Check it out.
Academician Keldysh himself was the subject of paranoid secrecy. For many years, Keldish's name was a state secret. He was known only as the anonymous chief theorist of cosmonautics. Roland Sagdayev, Russian expert in plasma physics and a former director of the Space Research Institute of the USSR Academy of Sciences.
I mean, seriously, that kind of makes Keldysh something like the Voldemort of the USSR. And, as if that mistrust wasn't enough, then Brezhnev came to the Kremlin and pulled the handbrake once again on all that talking to the Americans. Leonid Brezhnev had previously been the commissioner of all military industry issues before entering the Politburo. And, my friends, Leonid was certain that the USSR had a clear advantage and that there was no point in collaborating with the Americans. Why help them if they could beat them? But it turns out he was wrong. Brezhnev had made a huge mistake. And why? Because just a few years later, the Nixon administration would overtake them with Neil Armstrong walking on the moon and putting his little American flag on the surface of our closest heavenly body. So, with Armstrong's little stroll on the mood in the Kremlin was no longer the same. And then, suddenly, plot twist. Because it's here that Gregory Peck and Gene Hackman appeared on the scene. And yes, no seriously, I have not gone mental, I am being genuine. It turns out that in 1970, at a top-level meeting between the Soviet and American scientists, the Americans came up with something that would leave the Russian scientists very, very lost. You see, Philip Handler, then president of the United States Academy of Sciences, started talking to Keldysh, the chief scientist of the USSR, about a film that had been released in Hollywood. The film, Marooned, told the story of 3 American astronauts who were lost in space and who were ultimately rescued by Soviet cosmonauts. And let's just say that those raised in the land of the hammer and sickle had a little bit of trouble grasping all this. I mean, Why was Hollywood seeming to create Soviet propaganda? What was up with that? And take note, because Handler actually managed to convince them that in the face of a catastrophic situation like the one presented in the film, it would be necessary to have compatible systems in order to work together. And what's even more surprising is they came to an agreement, and not just a symbolic one, but a historical agreement. In the middle of the Cold War, with both countries keeping their fingers poised on the nuclear button, these two great enemies smoked the peace pipe just long enough to develop the Apollo-Soyuz collaboration project. That is impressive.
New possibilities are opening up for fruitful development of scientific cooperation between countries and the peoples in the interests of peace and progress of all humanity. Leonid Brezhnev.
However, my friends, on the 20th of January 1981, the United States space strategy would take a 180-degree turn. Because, my friends, on that day, a new man arrived at the White House. Listen to this.
Star Wars.
On the 20th of January 1981, Ronald Wilson Reagan entered the White House with a seemingly crazy idea: to disable the nuclear arsenal of their arch-enemy, the Soviet Union. His goal? To render the threat, the idea of mutually assured destruction, totally obsolete. So, Ronald Reagan wanted to write off decades of military strategy.
I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete.
And the big question is, how on earth did the then President of the United States hope to turn all of the Soviets' nuclear power into just a bunch of harmless old bricks? Well, in order to answer that question, my friends, I first have to ask you another question. Does the term Star Wars ring a bell? And I'm not talking about 3 great movies and 6 terrible ones. Well, on the 23rd of March 1983, Ronald Reagan introduced the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as the Star Wars Initiative. Their goal was to build a system both on Earth and in space capable of dismantling and annihilating any attempt at a Soviet nuclear attack. But, wait a minute, this sounds simple, but how exactly do you do it? The truth is that, in spite of everything, at the beginning, there was really no clear idea of how to go about this. The scientists and experts put forward many different possibilities, all the way from laser weapons installed on the ground or in space to different types of missiles and tracking systems. However, later on, what they seemed to be betting on, because all of this is a top secret, highly confidential matter, was to develop small missiles launched from space itself, known as brilliant pebbles. In this way, Reagan's idea was to make the Soviet nuclear military system obsolete by leaving the USSR totally exposed in offensive and defensive matters. But was Reagan bluffing? Or did he really think this was all possible? Well, the truth is that it really didn't matter all that much. The point was that the Soviet Union believed, and it seemed that all this SDI Star Wars stuff worried them a lot. Listen up.
The Soviet Union believed that the great technological potential of the United States had scored again and treated Reagan's statement as a real threat. Anatoly Dobrinin, Soviet ambassador to the US from 1962 to 1986. Maybe we should just stop being afraid of SDI. Of course, we can't simply disregard this dangerous program, but we should overcome our obsession with it. They're banking on the USSR's fear of SDI in moral, economic, political, and military terms. They're pursuing this program to wear us out. Gorbachev in a speech to the Politburo in March 1986.
So as you can hear, the truth is that in the Kremlin, they were starting to become obsessed with this whole Star Wars thing. It went a bit like this. I mean, okay, what if Reagan is just bluffing and he does not have the technology at all? But, okay, on the other hand, what if they do have the technology? That would be the end of the Cold War. Well, The fact is that the Soviets, who were beginning to feel cornered, did not stand idly by, and instead, they raised the stakes. In 1987, the Soviets launched the military spacecraft Polyus from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. This spacecraft was equipped with a skiff laser system and a Kassad missile system. Their goal? To bring down Reagan's SDI spaceship by putting their own mega weapon into orbit. What was the result though? They didn't succeed into putting it into orbit. The ship was shattered in the blink of an eye. And in this way, the Star Wars strategy became an unprecedented bargaining chip for the Reagan administration.
Dovii no provii. Trust but verify.
No doubt about it, every time Reagan and Gorbachev sat down, Star Wars always came up. At the Geneva Bilateral Summit of 1985, at the Reykjavik Summit of 1986, at the Washington Summit of 1987, and the Moscow Summit of 1988.
The Strategic Defense Initiative, in fact, proved to be the ultimate bargaining chip, and we played it for all it was worth. George Shultz, the US Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan.
But then, in the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Star Wars seemed to be redundant. And although the program was never formally cancelled, its budget was drastically reduced after the fall of the USSR. So then, is that it? Is the Cold War over? Is the concept of space as a battlefield dead and buried? Do I never get a laser gun? Well, not at all, because there is still much more. Because you see, in January 2001, we would see a new turning point in terms of space policy. That month, Donald Rumsfeld, future Secretary of Defense in the new George W. Bush administration, alerted Congress from an independent commission he chaired to a new imminent danger. The United States was on the verge of a new Pearl Harbor, but it was a Pearl Harbor in space. Listen up.
The Space Forces.
So, according to the latest available data from the Union of Concerned Scientists, the United States has, at the time of making this video, 1,327 operational satellites in orbit, of which approximately 30% belong to the government or the military. No other country has so many satellites. To give you an idea, according to existing estimates, Russia has around 169 and China 363. And the influence of these American satellites on our daily lives is astronomical. Get it? There is barely a day that we don't use one. When you ask for an Uber and it tells you when it has arrived, when you travel by plane, when you make a transfer through your bank's website, it's on and on and on. But as you might be able to imagine, this whole setup is not just to provide conveniences for the civilian world. In the military field, satellites have become a key tool. Communications, navigation, reconnaissance, missile detection, target setting. To be clear, the wars of the present and the future are already being fought from space. Thus, as the Rumsfeld Commission pointed out in 2001 when it warned of a potential Pearl Harbor scenario in space, it would look like a coordinated attack on US military satellites, which would render the most powerful army on Earth blind and inoperative. How would they control their drones? How would they know what was happening in a location before they set foot on the ground? How would they communicate with their troops? Paradoxically, the same concept of Star Wars that once alleviated the fear of the enemy in times past is today very, very worrying to the North American giant. And that fear is not for nothing. In recent years, non-allied countries such as China have shown themselves capable of destroying satellites with missiles without breaking a sweat. In fact, in 2007, in a demonstration of force by Beijing, the Chinese giant destroyed one of its own weather satellites, the Fengyun 1C, with a medium-range missile, the SC-19. A missile that, although launched without an explosive charge, achieved the destruction of the satellite by simply colliding with it. And here's a fun and also depressing fact. This controlled collision generated more than 3,000 fragments that today orbit the Earth in the form of space junk. There are no records of any space event that has generated as much debris as this operation. And this is important because due to the speed with which they circulate in space, even the smallest particles can be very dangerous for functioning satellites, space stations, or rockets. But it didn't stop there. In 2013, China launched a new anti-satellite weapon into space, but this time much further away. It reached some 18,600 miles away, approaching, in space terms at least, US satellites that were 22,000 miles away from the Earth. On that occasion, China claimed that it was just a scientific experiment, nothing to be concerned about. But Today, we know that what China did that day was basically a performance test of its new weapon, the Dongning 2, a ground-to-space missile with the ability to reach high Earth orbit. That is, placing an object more than 20,000 miles away. All these events made Rumsfeld's words of warning resound in the White House, a space Pearl Harbor. And precisely because of this, at the end of 2014, as Douglas Lovero, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, tells us, Barack Obama gave the order to incorporate a line item into the budget to resume research in this field of space defense. But, my friends of VisualPolitik, at this point the question is, what about Moscow? Did Putin just stand by and watch as Xi Jinping's China prepared for a possible space war? No, of course not. Not at all. In 2017, with Trump already in the White House, the Russian Federation launched a rocket. Now, pay attention here. And from that rocket, a satellite came out. And from that satellite, 2 more came out. In the military community, this device came to be nicknamed the Russian nesting satellites. Yeah, just like those cute little wooden dolls. Well, these satellites began to make maneuvers that allowed them to change orbit with all the unpredictability and shadiness that entails. And that's not all. On a separate occasion, another Russian satellite followed several US and Allied satellites. Of course, you don't have to be Einstein to imagine that if your goal is to be able to destroy satellites, having the technology to carry out that goal is a pretty important step. And in the land of rock and roll, apple pie, and terrible beer, how have they dealt with all these developments? Well, although in the United States everything related to space had historically been channeled through the Air Force, in August 2019, Trump reactivated Reagan's former US Space Command. And pay attention, because the reactivation of this division was only the first step. Later that year, Trump decreed the creation of the USSF, the United States Space Force. With fewer than 20,000 men, this new branch of the army, dressed, by the way, in camouflage uniform because allegedly the personnel comprising the Space Forces, in spite of their name, are on the ground, it's in charge of training in the face of possible adverse scenarios related to satellites. I don't know. Imagine, for example, that a command is about to deploy to carry out a special mission, and at that moment, the satellite they are communicating with mysteriously fails. At that point, a division of the USSF comes into action and would reassign a new satellite to the command. In addition, if the satellite fails as a result of an attack, they will study how to disable, or, if necessary, destroy the external agent. That said, it must be stated that there is currently no clear and agreed upon vision of what the USSF should be. It seems that the most accepted vision would be of a Coast Guard-like style Space Force, if you can imagine such a thing, responsible for ensuring, as much as possible, a safe space environment for US and Allied commercial satellites. And for their part, throughout all of these developments, China and Russia have played a strong negotiating trump card. If you don't want us to install weapons in space, let's make an agreement that we all sign up to. But on this occasion, the response from the United States has been a categorical no. The Americans say that they are not sure that they can verify that the agreement is being fulfilled, and that, furthermore, this would not prevent the accumulation of ASAT devices on the ground, ready to be launched into space. But what do you all think? If it were up to you, would you sign such an agreement trusting the other countries, or would you use all available resources to be the first to achieve technological superiority? And will that help me get a laser gun? Leave your answers in the comments below. So, we really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos here on VisualPolitik. Don't forget also to check out our friends on the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not my dulcet tones. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting our mission of providing independent political coverage. And, as always, I'll see you next time.
If you want to learn more about politics and world affairs and hear some more of my lovely voice, come check out the Reconsider podcast, where we don't do the thinking for you. Find Reconsider at www.reconsidermedia.com or on Apple or Google Play or your favorite podcatcher.